And United Airlines Boeing 747 shudders fiercely as one of its engines begins to fail seconds after leaving San Francisco. The severe vibrations startle the passengers and cause problems for the pilots reading their instruments. The airplane is losing height and speed within seconds. As the plane veers off track and straight into a mountain, the pilots fight valiantly with the controls. Petrified citizens below the flight route call the airport, worried about the worst a jet may crash into their area might bring about. Before time runs out, will the pilots be able to save their crippled aircraft? The balance of almost 300 lives hangs. United Airlines Flight 863's journey is told here. At San Francisco International Airport, 288 passengers and 19 crew members boarded United Airlines Flight 863 on June 28, 1998, late night. Their trip, 15 hours, was headed towards Sydney, Australia. Most of the passengers were settling down and hoped for some sleep as this was an overnight journey. This is 1998. There were no cell phones. The Boeing 747-400 was the airplane flying this distance. Having 44 of the type in use, United Airlines was the biggest operator of this aircraft in the United States. It comprised the backbone of their long-distance fleet. On this evening in the cockpit were 4 pilots, a captain, a first officer, 2 relief pilots seated behind them. Over the journey across the Pacific Ocean, the relief pilots would assume command. Having flown more than 23,000 hours, the captain was among United Airlines' most seasoned pilots. With just 900 hours on the 747-400, he was somewhat fresh to this aircraft, however. Having approximately 10,000 hours of flying experience, First Officer also was a seasoned pilot. Comprising 2,500 hours on the 747, he had more time than the captain. Just after 10:30 that evening, the huge airplane moved out from the San Francisco gate. Ignorant not only of the fact they would not reach Sydney that night, but also of the reality their own lives would be in great risk within just a few minutes. The passengers settled in for the long ride. Within a few short minutes, the pilots would be in an emergency. One they had practiced many times, but one which would challenge the caliber of that instruction on this particular day. This event would cause industry-wide reforms in pilot training, and its effects would go well beyond just crisis circumstances. Taxiing out to runway 28R in San Francisco, the pilots prepared the aircraft for takeoff. With almost a full load of people and tanks, loaded with more than 170 tons of gasoline for the lengthy Pacific trip, the aircraft was heavy. This would be precisely at the limit of what the 747 could do. The first officer engaged takeoff power and guided the giant aircraft onto the runway shortly after 10:30. The aircraft thundered down the runway, and the first officer drew it into the air as it hit takeoff speed. The airplane trembled with loud pumping sounds within seconds. Strong vibrations, some of which the pilots could hardly see on their instruments, abound. The first officer originally believed that a tire had broken, but the captain saw that the exhaust gas temperature of engine number 3, the inboard engine on the right-hand side, had surpassed usual norms. Rising to dangerously scorching 750 degrees Celsius, it was the skipper rapidly turned the throttle lever for engine 3 back to idle. The temperature went back to normal in seconds, and the tremors ceased. Now, however, the pilots faced a fresh challenge. Now only about 3/4 of their typical engine power. They were about as heavy as they could be. Apart from this, the aircraft had begun to spin to the right as less force was emanating from the right-hand side than the left. It was now headed northwest from the airport toward the 1,300-foot high San Bruno Mountain, a crash path. The pilots, however, were still ignorant of this. The skipper was preoccupied reacting to all the alerts brought up and switching off the engine. As the first officer piloted the aircraft, he instructed the 2 relief pilots to complete the engine shutdown checklist. When the first officer applied his inputs on the controls, the aircraft seemed slow and lethargic. Trying to straighten the right-hand turn the aircraft had lately, he had begun gripping the control column to the left. But this was entirely against the instruction he had received on handling an engine breakdown. First officer was putting the ailerons and spoilers up on the left wing by correcting the slide to the right using the control column. These produced considerable drag, therefore slowing down the aircraft. Since using the rudder would have allowed the plane to fly in a straight line, which generates almost as little drag on the aircraft, the right reaction to the turn would have been to do so. The airplane was now dangerously sluggish, even as the first officer had halted the turn to the right. It was just about on edge to stutter. There would be nowhere to retrieve it if it stopped at this height. It would just plummet out of the heavens and collide with the heavily inhabited residential area below, resulting in uncountable death. The replacement pilots then became aware that the aircraft's airspeed had decreased dramatically. Both yelled airspeed at once, alerting the first officer of his slow speed, which had dropped 40 knots. The stick shaker then turned on, fiercely rattling both pilots' control columns. This let the crew know the aircraft was ready to stall. The captain's focus reverted to aircraft flying. Rising from the first officer, he dropped the aircraft's nose to stop a stall. Then another horrible warning went out. The ground proximity alert warning system. This warned the pilots they were approaching a crash with a mountain ahead. It advised them to pull up, but they were unable to do so since they were about to stall. Actually, the captain was forced to keep the plane's nose farther toward the mountain. Watching in terror as the radio altimeter neared zero, the captain back at the airport, the controller watched helplessly as aircraft 863 swerved off course, dropped, and finally vanished from radar. Distressed local people started phoning the airport about the path the aircraft was flying. The low-flying aircraft's tremendous boom was almost deafening, and they were scared the plane would crash. As the skipper maintained the aircraft on the knife edge between a stall and a rise, it started to pick up speed steadily. Just around 30 meters separated the airplane from the San Bruno Peak when it sailed over it seconds later. Stated differently, it represents less than half the 747's wingspan. As the jet's speed rose, the pilot then ascended slowly, and the crew reported an emergency to air traffic control. There was a dilemma even though they wanted to go back to San Francisco. They landed far too heavily. Should they land at their present weight, the aircraft may break apart on the runway. To land, they would have to dump a lot of gasoline. The crew received directions from San Francisco Air Traffic Control to fly across the Pacific Ocean and ascend to 5,000 feet. They broke out from the clouds at last as they ascended and came into a clear night sky. Reaching 5,000 feet, they withdrew the flaps and started whirling out into the Pacific. The crew started fueling from here. 30 minutes had gone since the pilots started burning gasoline. They had dumped around 60 tons in this period. Still, they were too heavy for land. But the San Francisco weather had turned foggy during this period. Actually, the vision was deteriorating minute by minute. Should the crew keep pouring gasoline, they ran the danger of not being able to land in San Francisco and having to reroute. Should they choose to go back to San Francisco now, however, they would be arriving overweight and running the danger of aircraft damage. Still overweight, the crew decided, after a conversation in the cockpit, that it would be more prudent to land back at San Francisco. The crew touched down on runway 28R at San Francisco at 11:30 that evening. Every 307 passenger and staff member had emerged from the event intact. The travelers were not sure precisely how near they had come to calamity. For them, their return to San Francisco was only a sad conclusion to what ought to have been a trip to Sydney. Only over the next days would they learn in the press that they had almost raced over the San Bruno mountain. Although it's a major incident, losing an engine during takeoff shouldn't be life-threatening. Why had this flight so near to catastrophe? Given the regrettable location of the San Bruno mountain north of the airport, was this unavoidable? As it happens, There was no reason this aircraft needed to have gone so near to catastrophe. The 4 pilots were questioned after the incident. The first officer said he had pulled back in his control column in response to the engine failing, therefore mitigating the loss of thrust. Though it was not what he had been taught to do, this natural reaction sought to keep the airplane at a rise. Time. In an airplane, maintaining the airspeed above stall speed always takes first importance. The first officer allowed the aircraft speed to decrease by drawing back in his control column. Further aggravating this airspeed issue was his use of the ailerons to offset the asymmetric thrust upon engine failure instead of the rudder. This slowed down the airplane yet further. Should the relief pilots have not seen that the airspeed was dangerously low, the speed would have decreased significantly more, and the result of this trip would not have been so fortunate. Rudder to trim the aircraft in an asymmetric thrust condition. Procedures he would have practiced in the simulator many times since being licensed to fly the 747. As it happens, merely glancing at the hours the first officer had spent flying the 747 would fool one. In the year before this occurrence, he had only made 1 takeoff and 1 landing, even though he had 2,500 hours of expertise in this aircraft. He was so very out of experience at manually piloting the aircraft. This meant that he was simply unable of employing fundamental manual flying techniques to maintain the aircraft within safe limits when the engine failed upon takeoff. On this evening, however, the first officer was not the only flight crew member failing to perform at his best. Although the captain admitted later that his choice to concentrate only on troubleshooting the failing engine rather than on monitoring the first officer's handling of the aircraft contributed to the plane's near approach with the mountain, he nevertheless clearly rescued the aircraft. In the end, the pilots cannot be the only ones to blame for the almost catastrophic event. The airlines, not the first officer, were responsible for the fact that he had only completed 1 takeoff and landing in the year before this event. How had United Airlines set its calendar so that a pilot in charge of hundreds of lives could be so out of practice at a time as vital as an engine failure? United recorded a reenactment of the flight in one of their simulators in the weeks after the event in acknowledgement of this shortcoming. They demonstrated it to every 9,500 of their pilots and underlined the need of properly operating the rudder in reaction to an engine loss. They also changed their training courses to guarantee that flight crews get more thorough instruction on handling engine failures and a range of other situations. Since then, these more exacting standards have been accepted throughout the sector. Thank you all for tuning in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on our future content. Until next time, stay curious, stay creative, and keep exploring.